Good evening and welcome. I'm C.C. Clement. I'm Deputy Director at the Yale Center for British Art, and the focus of my work is the conservation of our magnificent building by Louis Kahn. It's my great privilege to introduce Wendy Lesser, the author of the new Kahn biography entitled You Say to Brick, The Life of Louis Kahn, which was published by Farrar, Straus Giroux in March of this year. As architectural critic and educator Paul Goldberger has written, Wendy Lesser's You Say to Brick combines a compelling narrative of Kahn's unusual life with a sensitive and knowing analysis of his extraordinary architecture. Few architectural biographies manage to be engaging, thought-provoking, and uplifting at the same time, but this one does. Ms. Lesser earned her BA in History and Literature at Harvard, an MA in English at King's College, Cambridge, and a PhD in English at UC Berkeley. She's the founding and current editor of the Threepenny Review. She's also the author of 11 books, including 1 novel and 10 works of nonfiction, among them Music for Silenced Voices about Shostakovich's quartets, and Why I Read. She's received awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy in Berlin, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Daedalus Foundation, and many other institutions. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the New York Institute for the Humanities. Her journalistic writing about literature, dance, film, and music has appeared in many periodicals in America and abroad, including the New York Times Book Review, the London Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement. I first met Wendy when she came to New Haven in the spring of 2016 as the center reopened after a 16-month closure to upgrade our infrastructure, conserve our public spaces, and reinstall our collections. We were delighted by her superb article about the center's building conservation project, which appeared in the New York Times that April. Following the lecture, I invite you to join us for a reception in the library court on the 2nd floor, where there will be books available for you to purchase, and Wendy has kindly agreed to sign them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wendy Lesser, whose lecture is entitled Louis Kahn as Artist and Collaborator. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to this and for having me to your community and your absolutely beautiful Kahn building. It's a pleasure to speak in this kind of setting, and that pleasure partly explains why we have a beautiful concrete wall behind us instead of slides of any kind. If you want to see Louis Kahn's work, you can just wander around the building or go across the street and see his first major commission at the Yale Art Gallery, and I don't need to show you pictures. In any case, his work doesn't show up as well in two-dimensional pictures. So that's why we don't have slides, and why I'm mainly speaking to you directly rather than delivering a prepared talk is because Kahn himself believed that communication took place best in this informal mode that could mimic one person speaking to another and was, as he said, an event rather than a performance. And you'll hear these echoes of those words later in my talk. Before I speak about Louis Kahn, I just want to take a moment to comment on the fact that this is November 8th, the first anniversary of dire circumstances in our nation's history, and to say that I think of Louis Kahn as in some way the opposite of an ambitious, power-hungry developer. They may both put up buildings, but Louis Kahn, from the beginning of his career, was concerned with the public good, from the beginning to the end. So he did a lot of great buildings that were meant for the public, for all members of the public, many of them with free access for people to come in and out. He was an immigrant. He was a Jew who designed a beautiful mosque in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And he was a terrible businessman, and he was proud of that. So I commemorate him on this date. And now I want to speak about him as an artist and collaborator, by which I mean an architect. He was very much an architect. The minute he discovered architecture, which was in his senior years in high school, he knew that's what he wanted to do. But before that, he had shown huge artistic talent. And so I'll talk about that first, the path not taken. Louis Kahn as an artist of the sort we're more familiar with from looking at paintings and in this building and others. And then I'll talk about what kinds of transitions were necessary, what kinds of other ways of thinking were necessary for him to become an architect who is always, it seems to me, a collaborator in various ways, and in Louis Kahn's case, had to be a really good collaborator. So Lou, I'll call him Lou, sometimes I slip into that by mistake, because all the people I spoke to in interviewing him called him Lou. Lou, and besides I'm talking about him as a child, Lou started out when he was a very small boy being interested in art. His earliest childhood memory from his 5 years that he spent on a small island off the coast of Estonia, that's where he grew up until the family came to America. So from 0 to 5, he lived on that island, which is now called Saaremaa, and I forget what its original name was, and the town that he grew up in is now called Kuressaare. His childhood memory from when he was about 2 or 3 is of drawing on a frozen window with his finger and making a pattern on that window. Okay, fast forward to the year he comes over here. He's 5 years old, it's 1906, and he and his mother and his 2 younger siblings are taking a ship from Liverpool, which is where you left anywhere in Europe to get to America, to Philadelphia. His father's already in Philadelphia, came here 3 or 4 years earlier to establish a place to bring the family over to. So they're on the boat, they're poor, they're coming to America for the first time, and this is what he remembers of it. I remember having come over with my mother and sister and brother on the boat from Estonia. I was 5 years old. Because I could draw, I made drawings of whatever happened. It was pointed out to me that the smoke from one boat was going the other way. It was a very slow boat, and the smoke was faster than the movement of the boat, or the boat was arrested at that time. The captain called my attention to it, and because he liked the drawing so much, my mother thought we would give it to him. As a result, we had oranges every day, and that was really something. Oranges were a rare thing, and I was very proud. So quite early on, he had a sense of the benefits of art as well as the pleasures of doing it. And then when he got here to America, he was enrolled in the Philadelphia public schools. His father had been a stained glass artist in Europe and found various other kinds of manual labor work here, but then soon hurt his back or did something. Leopold Kahn was not a hard worker, as all the surviving relatives told me. So from the time they lived in America, Bertha Kahn, Lou's mother, pretty much supported the family as a garment worker and in a candy shop. They were very poor. They lived in tenement housing in the Northern Liberties section of Philadelphia. But as Lou said, they lived a special kind of life. He said, I was born into the consideration of art as a part of life, not something that's attached to life in a peripheral way. My parents were in the middle of it. My mother had been a harpist and my father a stained glass worker, and we knew that art was in everyone's life. And he has said that that sort of differentiated them from other people who lived around them in the Northern Liberties and who he felt lived more hand to mouth, had less of a sense of a wider world than in his own little family. There were some squabbles about art in his family because his father had very strong opinions. So Lou tells one of those stories. One day I was copying a portrait of Napoleon. His left eye was giving me trouble. Already I had erased the drawing several times. My father lovingly corrected my work. I threw pencil and paper across the room saying, now it's your drawing, not mine. And so that gives you a sense of the dynamic in the family, of the strong personality of the child, and of what art meant to him, you know, his serious sense of ownership of it. When he was in about 4th grade, he started school late because he had scarlet fever and had to stay out late. So had to start late, a year late. So probably maybe when he was about 10 or 11, he got enrolled in a special program that was in the Philadelphia public schools at that time. Children who had shown some kind of artistic talent were allowed to join the art classes taught by J. Liberty Tad. And Tad was a very unusual person. He was part of the progressive movement, and he also had been influenced by Thomas Eakins and the whole Philadelphia art movement. And he taught classes to kids of all income levels and all backgrounds. All they had to do was be recommended by a teacher who thought they were good artists. And so Lou went there, I think, for half a day every week and was trained in J. Liberty Tad's method of drawing, which he considered a sort of natural training. He kept using that word natural. He was kind of linked to the transcendentalists and the whole Emersonian notion of the innocent, knowledgeable child that needs to be released, the divine self that's in every human being that art can release. So that was part of the influence of Tad on Louis Kahn, but there were very, very specific influences as well. One of the things he trained the kids in was ambidextrous drawing. He would have them draw with both hands, singly and then together on a board. And if you look in my book or anywhere else, if you go online and you Google Louis Kahn, you will soon come upon photographs of him doing that as an adult, drawing with both hands simultaneously, circles usually, which he could do freehand, but he could do them both at once. And that he learned as a child from J. Liberty Tad. If he had the talent for it already, it was encouraged by J. Liberty Tad. The other thing that Tad did often was have them draw from nature. He would bring in a rock or a log or a dead animal or a picture of a live animal or something, and he would have the kids draw that. And he also had them model in 3 dimensions, in clay and in wood, as he said, in soft material and in hard, and then draw the thing that they had modeled, so to give them a sense of the relationship between 3 dimensions and 2. And this is something that Kahn carried into his work as an architect, and it was often commented upon by his colleagues, how well he could translate the 3 dimensions he wanted in the world into the 2 dimensions of a drawing and the other way around. He had a very strong sense of space and its relationship to an architect's drawing. So here's something that Tad said in his 1899 book, New Methods of Education. Drawing and manual training, properly taught, are modes of thought expression, just as speech and writing are modes of thought expression. One who accurately draws a bird or a skeleton or a flower or a mathematical problem has a more complete mastery of that special topic than could be gained in almost any other way. And not only is that a useful thing for a child who's terrible at school but excellent at drawing to know, because Lou was really terrible at school at that point. He just couldn't get academic subjects. He didn't grasp them, he didn't do well in them, he didn't do his homework, but he loved drawing. So this was somebody telling him drawing is knowledge, drawing is a way to grasp the world. But it's something that seemed to last for the rest of his life, so that a very wise architect named Shamsul Waris, who is Bangladeshi and who I interviewed when I went to Dhaka, and who also appears in Nathaniel Kahn's movie, My Architect. He has some of the most moving scenes in that movie where he's filmed in the building in Dhaka that Lou designed. So Shamsul Waris said this to me about Louis Kahn. He is unlike many architects who instantly conceive what they want to do. He's someone who can put up his ideas through his drawings, not through his brain, but through his drawings. He cannot come to the final version at the beginning. So he really took in this training from Tad. And he then went to high school at Central High School in Philadelphia, which was a very good high school academically and in every other way. And he still didn't do well in school academically. But when he got to his senior year, he had a teacher, William Gray, who taught architecture. And Lou enrolled in that class, and he loved it, and he instantly felt, this is what I was meant to do. And years later, in fact, when one of his architecture students from Penn, Richard Saul Werman, who graduated in architecture, had a degree in architecture, practiced architecture for a few years, including in Lou's office, but then went off to do all sorts of other things, including founding TED Talks and writing about 80 books. You know, he's still producing as far as I know. Anyway, he told me that as he was drifting off from architecture into all these other fields, he said to Lou, "Lou, do you think I should just concentrate in architecture the way you have instead of dallying around in all these different areas?" And Lou said to him, "Ricky, even when I brush my teeth, I'm an architect. You should do whatever you want to do." You know, meaning he was dyed in the wool, that's what he was. And it's partly that kind of story and that kind of personality that made me choose You Say to Brick as the title of my book, because You Say to Brick comes from a story that goes like this, that Lou would often tell. You say to Brick, "What do you want, Brick?" And Brick says, "I like an arch." And then you say to Brick, "But I could build a concrete lintel and it would be much cheaper." And Brick says, "I like an arch." And I think that's what Lou was like. You know, he was who he was all the way through, and he continued to be that. So he embarked on his architecture career, and he studied at Penn from, I think, about 1920 to 1924. And then he worked for a number of years in architecture firms in Philadelphia, as they did in those days, a sort of apprenticeship that would lead to being a full-fledged architect. And he did all that he was supposed to do, and he was earning good money in at least one of these firms. So he resolved to take the grand tour of Europe. He did not come from a class that automatically sent their kids off to the grand tour of Europe, but he decided this is the finishing touch to an architectural education, and he would do that. So in 1928 and 29, he went on a 15-month trip in Europe. And he sketched the whole time. And while he was there, that reignited his interest in his own art. And when he got back here, he continued to sketch, and draw and paint. And he also began to exhibit his work. And he showed it in several shows of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He would have things selected out, as he had every year when he was in high school. When he was a kid, all of his paintings and drawings would win in the kid department. You know, he would be the best sophomore, the best junior in Philadelphia in art. But now he was doing it as an adult. And it gave him, I think, quite a bit of satisfaction to know that he still had this passion for drawing in charcoal, in black and white, but also painting and sketching in pastels, where he used color beautifully. And if you have a chance to look, some of these pictures will be online, and there are also a few books of them, of the paintings and drawings of Louis Kahn. You can see how talented he was, and his work doesn't really look like anybody else's. Some of the lighting effects, especially in the Italian piazzas and other Italian scenery, looks a bit like De Chirico, and some of the portraits, especially the line drawings, look a little like Picasso of the Rose period, and some of the other portraits are edging into Cubism, but nobody does work exactly like his. He had a real talent for it. Whether he ever could have made a living, who knows? But as I say, he didn't make much of a living as an architect. He died $500,000 in debt, so he was going to do what he cared to do, no matter what. So he did decide to put his energies into architecture, and what that meant was leaving behind that world where he could throw the pencil across the room and say, "It's not yours now, it's mine." In the world of architecture, especially as he practiced it, it had to be a group effort. And it also had to relate to the world in a way that painting didn't necessarily, as he pointed out when he said, "A painter can make doorways smaller than people. A sculptor can make square wheels on a carriage to express the futility of war. The architect has to make doors bigger than people and has to use round wheels." So he accommodated himself to the world, gravity, of course, being one of the big collaborators that any artist needs to work with, who's an architect. But he also had many other collaborators, and so now I'll try and kind of illustrate how that worked, the collaboration in his work, with two buildings that I think are major achievements. He really did almost all his major achievements in the last 15 years of his life. The Yale Art Gallery was done before that. That's really the first building that put him on the map. And there are a few other wonderful buildings that were done before his last 15 years. But most of the buildings we know him for, including this one, were in the last 15 years of his life. So the two that I'm going to focus on are the Salk Institute, which is out in California, where I'm from, and this one. So the Salk, he had many collaborators. First of all, he had his whole office. His office was very small. One of the reasons people give for his relatively small output over the course of a 50-year career, given how well-liked he was and what a great architect he was. So one of the reasons they give is that he always had a pretty small office. He had maybe a dozen to 20 people working for him at any one time. And he was the only real top architect in the office. I mean, there were other people that had architecture degrees that were registered architects, but he had to approve every drawing that went out. He had to be the one that made all the final decisions about architecture. So it was a slow and complicated process, made slower by the fact that he would often change his mind and have to redo things, or he would get a great idea and it would cost 3 times more than the client was willing to pay, so he would have to redo things. So this building, like just about every other one he did, had 3 separate plans. And the people in his office respected him enormously, and some of them stayed with him for a long time. And at the time he was starting on the Salk Institute, he had 2 young guys in his office. One was very young, in his 20s. He was named Jack McAllister. And one was in his 30s. He was named Fred Langford, and he had done a lot of things, including working in construction before going to work in architecture. And Lou sent them both out to California to supervise the process of building the Salk Institute. So these 2 young guys that were not knowledgeable about putting together a building were essentially his people on the spot. And I'll talk about Fred a little more when I get into materials. Jack eventually became the project manager, the project architect for the Salk Institute, because he was a more practical person than Lou. And so Salk and the people that were funding it, the March of Dimes, wanted Jack organizing, how things work rather than Lou, but Lou was still the idea man. Okay, so he has his office. Then he has the site. Has anyone in this room been to the Salk Institute? Have you ever seen it? Yeah, okay, so you know what a beautiful site it is. It's located right on the coast. It's not actually on the beach. It's up high, so that you're probably, I don't know, a mile, half a mile from the coast, but you can see the Pacific Ocean there. You're on a cliff. And it was a 27-acre site or something given to Jonas Salk by the city of San Diego. It's just north of La Jolla. And so he had to decide what to do that would honor this site and that would make the site a participating part of the building. And one of the amazing things that he did was orient the building toward the Pacific Ocean so that you come, say, from the street that brings you there, North Torrey Pines, I think it's called. You drive up, you park in the lot in front, you walk through. At the time, now they've added buildings in the front, but at the time you would have walked through these big iron rusty gates into the central plaza. And on either side of you would be these wonderful jagged buildings that are the scientists' studies, and then behind them would be the low towers that are the labs. And it's very symmetrical, and you're walking in the center. Your path is obstructed by a fountain that you have to walk around, and then you're led forward by another fountain that's running all the way from the back of the plaza to the front, leading you toward this beautiful view that you see in the distance, the blue of the water, the blue of the sky, the changing blue of the sky as the sun goes up and down. And depending on what day of the year you're doing this, if you're doing it at the vernal equinox or the autumnal equinox, the sun is shining directly on the runnel of water that comes in front of you and leads you forward. It's oriented exactly that way. And then if you're coming at a different time of year, the sun sets and rises to either side of that. So it's a very beautiful, almost, I hesitate to use the word religious, because neither I nor Kahn was religious in the strict sense of the word, but it gives you the feeling of, say, those Greek temples in pestum, you know, of the ancient Greeks that built something to nature and to eternity, and that were meant to be larger than life, but also somehow elevate the human. That's what the Salk Institute is like. And it's largely or partly because he was able to use the site so well. The guy that runs the site, the maintenance man there, Tim Ball, took me around, and he had a practical explanation for everything. The beautiful runnel of water is recycling water. The orientation toward the sun is daylight harvesting, he called it. So there are all sorts of modern technical terms that are, you know, environmentally correct for what he was doing, and that are very practical, but you have the feeling when you're there that it was all done for aesthetic reasons. I have no idea which was the choice, but it was a good one. Then there's the client, Jonas Salk. In every case, Lou was very involved with the client, and when I speak about what he did here, I'll talk specifically about not only Paul Mellon, who was the original client, but Jules Brown, who was the actual practical client and who worked with Lou during the design process. So having a good client made a big difference. It meant that the building turned out well. And Lou was aware of this, and several of his great buildings had excellent clients, and he would mention them and single them out. And he always singled out Jonas Salk as one of his favorite clients. And Salk was one of his favorite clients partly because he would say what was wrong with Lou's work. So they had arrived at a design, which is not the Salk Institute as we now know it, but taller buildings grouped around several narrow plazas, not one central one. And they were hiring the contractors, and they were getting ready to do it, and Jonas Salk had second thoughts. This is Salk. It was twilight, he recalled. I tried to imagine how the buildings would look, and I must say I suddenly became terribly unhappy. The following day, March 28th, Kahn and Salk had an appointment scheduled in San Francisco to present the status of the project to its funders, that is, to the March of Dimes. Well, I told Lou on the plane the next morning that I thought we had to start over again, Dr. Salk said, because I really was not happy about the plans, and I sketched for him what I thought I didn't like, and also what I thought was needed. And Salk's objections centered on the extreme narrowness of the two gardens, not gardens at all, but two alleys, as he described them, and on the excessive width of the lab buildings. And when Salk made these complaints, Louis Kahn instantly heard what he said, instantly agreed, and redid the whole plan. And then Salk said this: he was always very gracious, saying that this gave him an opportunity to build an even greater building. And then they worked together on everything, including the color of the concrete. And this, I spent a day with Fred Langford, who's now in his late 80s, and was Lou's concrete guy on the Salk building, in Dhaka, and at the Kimball. And he really didn't know very much about concrete at all before he went out to San Diego, before Lou sent him out there. But Lou decided that this guy would be able to figure something out, and he did. And Fred made wonderful contributions to the concrete, including, as you look at the concrete here, first of all, it's got this wonderful smooth marble-like feel. The Salk was practically the first place that was done. And then the way it's been cast, and you can see this out in the entryway too, so that the making of the panel is part of what you're reading in the concrete. That was new. And that idea that you didn't try and cover up how you developed this, pouring it in a form and having those little holes show where it was tied into the plywood, having the texture of the plywood on, having the texture of the ridge between the pieces of plywood, all that is new. The Salk concrete looks different. This is very refined compared to that original effort. But it's beautiful in its own way out there, and Fred was very concerned with having it all look purposeful. So he lined up the form holes so that they would be parallel and symmetrical. That had never been done before. And he showed me in his study his drawings of the Salk Institute walls and how they were angled and with the little form holes all lined up, and it was just an amazing sight. And the guy he was working with, Jack McAllister, said, Fred influenced Lou's vision of concrete, and when Lou saw what could be done with concrete, then he used it even more because he saw what a wonderful material it was. So of course, the next thing to be thinking about is materials, and for Lou, that was also always important, and that too is why I called the book You Say to Brick, because he was in constant communion with his materials, and they mattered a lot to him. And I'll get to other elements like the travertine and the plaza in a minute. Another of his collaborators was August Commandant, his engineer, and Lou had worked with Commandant on the Richards Building in Philadelphia, which you may or may not have seen. I don't love it, but the architecture world does. They gave it a show of its own at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961. It's a super modern looking building. It does not look like the work that Lou did later here, or even that he did earlier at the Trenton Bathhouse. And Lou himself said, "The world celebrated me for the Richards Building, but where I really found myself was in that little bathhouse in New Jersey." And that's true. And if you ever can go and look at that, it's not actually in Trenton, it's in a little suburb outside of Trenton, but it's a very beautiful, little, rough building that was built to, so that people could change their clothes as they were going into the swimming pool. And it has the feel of his wonderful, mature works. But anyway, August Commandant came in on the Richards Building and figured out a lot of solutions to problems. August Commandant was a genius of an engineer. He was a very difficult man. Another engineer who worked with Lou and who's still alive said to me, "Very few people used Gus more than once. Lou used him more than once because he could work with him and he could, make it work. But Gus was really difficult." And August Commandant, after Lou died, August Commandant wrote a book called My 18 Years with Louis Kahn, in which he claimed all the buildings for himself. He had designed the Kimball Art Museum, he had designed the Salk Institute, etc. But Lou was very good-humored about this kind of thing when they were both still alive. He would say, "Okay, yeah, August Commandant is a great dramatist and actor, but he really can feel balance. He can feel symmetry. He can feel tension and weight and all the things that I can't, because I'm just an amateur, but he knows what he's doing. He doesn't even have to measure, he knows." And so he was very involved in doing things that allowed them, for instance, to have open labs for the whole length of the lab buildings. They don't have to have structural supports inside the labs because they've got them in these interstitial floors that come between the labs. And this, again, Tim Ball told me, has made a huge difference in the practice of science at the Salk Institute, because in all the years, now over 4 decades since it opened, they have not had to oust the scientists from their labs once. They can make all the updates that you need in a modern scientific building by going in through these interstitial floors that separate out each of the lab floors and doing all their work behind the scenes, and the scientists can keep working. So, and Tim Ball said, "I don't know of another scientific building in America that that's true of." Now we come to the plaza. So the studies, where the scientists have their separate little studies, are at the front of each structure, and then the labs are behind. And in between the facing studies is this beautiful area that I described to you, which is now covered in a kind of pale travertine. And travertine encases that narrow fountain that goes forward and reflects the sun, and it also covers all the ground. And the travertine is a color that goes well with the concrete, which Jonas and Lou thought about that color of the concrete over and over again and had test patches up, and no, that we're not going to have it that way. Let's have more pink in it. Let's have more green in it, like that, until they got the right color. So the travertine exactly picks that up, but also reflects the sun in a beautiful way. It does all sorts of things. Okay, that was not going to be there originally. A garden was going to be there. And they hired a landscape architect, who I won't bother to tell you his name, he's dead anyway. And he came in and he wanted to plant bushes. Imagine bushes right by the edge here, obscuring the meeting point of the concrete and the floor. And Lou realized this was not right. They were not going to have bushes right up against the concrete. And he had seen a picture of Louis Barragan's gardens in a Museum of Modern Art book that also featured a great unbuilt project of Louis Kahn's that he did with Isamu Noguchi. It was going to be a playground on the upper west side of Manhattan. It never got built for political and neighborhood reasons, but anyway, it got commemorated in this book, and also in this book was some work by Barragan. So Lou had a Spanish-speaking member of his office call Barragan in his office in Mexico City and say, "Louis Kahn's on the line, he would like to speak to you." And I met this guy, and he says to me, he puts his hand over the receiver, and he says, "Who are you?" And Lou says, "Tell him to ask some of his friends." Anyway, they have a friendly translated conversation on the phone, and then Lou goes down and meets Barragan in Mexico City, and then he flies him up to the Salk Institute to look at this expanse of mud that's between the two buildings. And Barragan gave him advice, and this is how Lou tells the story. "There should be no garden," says Barragan. "It should be a plaza." I looked at Salk, Kahn recalled. He looked at me, and we both agreed that a garden was not what we wanted. It should be a plaza. Barragan said, "If you make it a plaza, it will give you a facade to the sky." And it killed me because it was a wonderful idea. I could only counter it by saying, "That's right. Then I would get all those blue mosaics for nothing," meaning, of course, the Pacific. So Barragan gives him the idea for the plaza, and then he decides he wants to pave it in recinto, which is a very dark gray stone like an elephant's hide. Luckily, he couldn't get that. Then he decides he wants the pink of San Miguel de Allende. Luckily, that factory had been closed, so he couldn't get that pink marble. And so he decided, okay, we're going to go for Italian travertine. And Jack McAllister said to me, and that was the biggest order of Italian travertine that had ever been imported to America at that time, and it cost less than vinyl tile. And when you see the plaza now, you cannot imagine it without this beautiful pale travertine. It's just the most essential element, and yet chance, the final collaborator, entered in terms of the unavailability of the first two choices of materials. So I'll spend less time on the Yale Center for British Art because you all know it well and can experience it yourselves, read about it from the books that are in the bookshop here. But I will just say that, again, he went through the process of the site. It had to be an urban site, no landscaping, fitting into a place that was just delimited and relate to the other buildings on the street, relate to his own earlier gallery across the street. So all that makes it a very different project from the Salk, an urban project, and a project in which the exterior of the building has, in some ways, a very different meaning from the interior of the building. Then he has a client first, Paul Mellon, who insists on meeting with the architect, and so Lou goes down to Paul Mellon's house, and he talks with him about what he wants, and he sees his collection, and this was very influential in the design, so much so that if you look at the sketches that he made right at the beginning, before he ever really formulated what this building would look like, there's a sketch of a big room that has the Stubbs painting, the lion attacking a horse, on the wall. Just Lou's little quick sketch of that painting is in a big grand room. So the way that beautiful library court displays that painting was early on in his idea of this process. Then he worked for years, as many years as he had left, which was not so many, a couple, with Jules Brown, who was to be the first director of this new Center for British Art. And I think Jules is working on his own book about this process and what was entailed in it. But huge credit goes to Jules Brown for his influence on the project and the back and forth of his conversations with Louis Kahn. Then Kahn died very suddenly in March of 1974, coming back from a trip to India in horrible Penn Station. He had a heart attack and died, and his body was misplaced. The family didn't know where he was. The notification didn't get through, so for 2 days he was in missing persons. He was lost, and then they found him, and nobody expected him to die. He was very vigorous at the age of 75, almost 75. He would have turned, is that right? He just turned 75 in 74, yeah. Anyway, so the project was not finished at that point. A lot of the concrete had been poured. The top floor was not done at all. He had picked out a lot of the materials. He had specified what things should be like, but he hadn't finished it. And it was left to the project architect, who was a man named Marshall Myers, who had worked for Lou for many years and had been very influential in the Kimball Art Museum, for instance. A lot of the best ideas in the Kimball come from Marshall Myers. And when I asked one of their co-workers, Henry Wilcox, who was one of my big sources who stayed in Lou's office for 11 years with Lou and 9 years after finishing the DACA project. So I said to Henry, so if Marshall Myers thought of all these things about the Kimball, why doesn't he go around taking credit for it? Or why didn't he? Because he's dead now. And Henry said, Marshall was a grown-up, meaning, he didn't need to take credit. He knew this is how architecture works. We all work together. And this is Marshall Myers. Well, first of all, Marshall Myers had to do a lot more work than he expected. He thought it would be a little finish-up job. It took years for him to finish this building, and he had to do 300 extra drawings and make decisions about materials and all sorts of other things. But this is what he said about working with Lou. Describing the kind of gentle collaboration that took place in Kahn's office, where nobody took credit for his individual role in a design, Marshall would later say about Lou, he never worked alone. He couldn't. He needed to talk to someone. He needed a dialogue. Myers recalled how Kahn would sketch something, this is Myers, sketch something and then go away, and then about 3 days later, he would come back to see what had developed. He was always testing his ideas, looking for a consensus, and you weren't helping him at all if you just thought that every scratch on paper he did was something handed down from on high. Marshall also noted that, especially in the early stages of a project, Lou, quote, worked best with one person. He said that if I talk to many people, it is a performance, while if I talk to one person, it may perhaps be an event. So Marshall Myers still had Lou's voice in his ear, in a way, when he finished this building, and so did George Knight and his architectural firm when they did the renovation that just got finished a year ago. Because when I was here to write that article in the New York Times that Cece mentioned, I spoke to George Knight and I said, so what could guide you to do this? How did you decide to do this, that, and the other? And he said, well, the building lets you know what it needs. He said it's kind of a whisper. It's a very subtle building. It's a very refined building. He says, you kind of hear it saying in the back of your head, are you sure you want to do that? And as you see, it resulted very well. And then the other people that collaborate with Louis Kahn, I always feel, are the end users. We who come to the museum and see the art, or we who come to the Salk to visit the scientists, or you can just go there to have an architectural tour if you want, or we who travel to the Four Freedoms Park in New York just to walk in the FDR monument and see how it feels to be there, or those who go into the Exeter Library, the students who go to check out a book, but anybody can just walk in the front door and see what it's like. And everywhere I went to look at his buildings, I talked to the people that used them. So he thought about ordinary people and how they felt about space when he was designing his buildings. This is quite clear from the sketches, where there are people in some of the earliest sketches of all the buildings, but also from the designs. You can feel, as you walk into a Louis Kahn building, that you have been named king of the place. This wonderful space exists, like that atrium out there, or the length of the library court. It exists to make you feel grander, not diminished, not a little ant-like creature that's walking around in a giant skyscraper world, but somebody who has found a space that's large enough to enlarge you, but not so large that you feel small. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and I forgot to tell you at the beginning to think up a question, but please think one up, because the questions are my favorite part of this kind of event. So I'm going to sit here and be quiet until at least one person thinks up a question. And there are people with microphones on either side. If you raise your hand, they'll come to you.
You spoke of Kahns Office. Where was it located? Was it in New Haven?
No, it was in Philadelphia, always. I mean, once he moved to Philadelphia, he, in a way, never left Philadelphia. He was traveling all the time later in his life, but he was very loyal to Philadelphia. So even when he taught at Yale, which was his first teaching job, starting in 1947, he was commuting from Philadelphia. He would stay over one night here, but he would go back to Philadelphia. And the office moved, when he was young, in the 30s, and very unsuccessful, it was in his own house, which was his wife's parents' house. He lived for his entire adult life, practically, with his mother-in-law and his wife in their family house. Then, when he had a real firm that he was able to form in 1941 with George Howe, who was already a famous architect, and then another guy, Oscar Stonerov, they moved into an office in downtown Philadelphia. And then when he broke off on his own, he had 3 separate offices. But at the end, when he did all these major projects that we know about, it was at 1501 Walnut, corner of 15th and Walnut in Philadelphia. 2 floors.
Hi there. Could you speak to Louis Kahn's relationship or any sort of dialogue that happened between Kahn and Paul Rudolph, particularly when he worked in New Haven?
I didn't go into it in detail myself, so I only know a few anecdotes about it. That is, anecdotally, I know that Paul Rudolph remodeled the Yale Art Gallery without asking Lou what he had intended and without showing the designs to him, or without in any way acting as if a major architect had been there before him. And that irritated Lou. And it irritated other people on behalf of Lou even more than it irritated Lou, because Lou was not quick to anger. But, so there was a sort of a, and he also, Paul Rudolph was going to become the head of the department here, and a man that Lou had loved, well, George Howe, in fact, the same guy, had been running the Yale architecture department when Lou was hired. And when Lou saw that George was leaving, he began to make gestures toward moving to Penn. And Paul Rudolph taking over the department coincided with that. But at the very, very end of his life, as he was flying back from India, and it was a much longer trip even than it is now, and it's a really long trip now. So he had a layover in London at Heathrow Airport. He had missed his flight. He was waiting for the next one that he'd rebooked on, and he ran into a man he knew, Stanley Tigerman, who had been a student here at Yale and was also working in Dhaka and India at the same times that Lou was. And they had a chat about architecture in the airport. And Stanley Tigerman survived. Lou did not. Nobody would know about this chat if Stanley Tigerman didn't report it afterwards. And he said Lou looked terrible. He looked really worn out. He looked like a homeless bum. He just looked awful when he ran into him in the airport. But they had this wonderful chat about architecture. And then Lou gets up to walk away, and then he turns back and he says, Stanley, I haven't seen Paul in a long time, and I miss him. When you see him, tell him I think he's a really good architect. So that was practically the last thing he said to anybody he knew.
Yes, thanks so much for a great talk. It seems like to be a great architect, one doesn't just need raw talent and vision and big ideas and techniques and great designs, but also people skills. I love your story about him listening to his client, Jonas Kahn,
Jonas Salk.
Salk, and immediately embracing his client's ideas and implementing them. I love your story about the concrete that he learned from one of his subordinates, from one of his colleagues. And he adopted the techniques that were proposed to him. It seems like he was an excellent listener and a learner, in addition to all the genius attributes.
I think that's right.
I think that's a lesson for our students here, for the students at Yale, the architecture school students.
Yes, he could not have built the beautiful buildings he did without that talent that you just described. I should say he wasn't always a pushover. In other words, he knew what he thought was right and what wasn't right. So Jonas Salk made a correction and he knew right away it was right. But the Exeter Library wanted him to chop off the top floor after he'd arrived at the final design, and he said he would try, and he went back and he worked at it, and then he wrote them a letter, which I have a large portion of in my book, that explains why he couldn't do it. that it would wreck the building if he did what they wanted. So he wasn't always doing exactly what the client said. He weighed what the client said very heavily, but he, weighed it against his own notions. One more thing about collaborating with a client. Last week I was in Philadelphia speaking jointly with David Brownlee, who, together with David DeLong, wrote one of the earliest books about Louis Kahn. And somebody in the audience asked why Lou had accomplished so little, in his life. I mean, relatively speaking, given that he was such a great architect. And I handed that answer over to David, who knows far more about the history than I do. And David said something that I found very interesting and I'd never thought of before, that Lou was such a charming person, such an engaging person, that when he spoke to the client began to believe that his own interests and his architect's interests were the same. And that was frequently why there had to be 3 models of every building, because the client would get so enthused by this charming man's ideas that he would say, sure, let's have another story. Sure, let's have another terrace. Sure, let's have another hallway. And so the thing would multiply and grow enormous, and then it would be 3 times the budget that it should be. So David was saying in some ways it's best for architecture if the client realizes that his interests and the architect's interests are not identical. But with Lou, there was always this blurring because of his extreme lovability.
I had the pleasure of reading your book, and I must confess, I came away with a somewhat different impression of Louis Kahn. And it had to do with his relationship with the women in his life, but the women who were part of his collaborative projects. So if I remember correctly, the museum across the street, actually the ideas for the ceilings were not his, but actually the woman in his life who became pregnant and who was, I think, sent off to Europe to live in Italy for a year. I don't mean to detract from his greatness, but I think I was left with the impression that he was a selfish man. And one could say, yes, he engaged in collaboration, but it struck me that the end result of that collaboration was to all flow in his favor.
That is probably true. I tried to write the book in such a way that whoever you were, if you had known Lou, you would have the reaction that you would have if you had met him. And so some people who read the book fell in love with him, and some people who read the book had more of the reaction you did. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. Ann Ting, his collaborator on that building, was a brilliant architect herself. One of my primary informants on this book was her daughter, Alex Ting, who's a painter, an excellent painter. And all 3 children were very helpful to me on this book and all wanted the truth to come out. That was their aim. They did not want things about these 3 families to be swept under the carpet. But Ann Ting was a very strong woman. And, Marshall Meyer's contribution to the Kimball includes that light beam that goes behind the reflectors and the cycloid arc that is the shape of the Kimball. Those are major contributions. He gets subsumed into Louis Kahn. So it's not gender related. It's Louis Kahn is running the office. He makes it quite clear to everybody that's his office. And Anne, like Marshall, had to have her work subsumed under his. Anne did get pregnant, but she was not sent off to Italy. She was going to go to Italy anyway. She made the choice that it would be socially uncomfortable. Of course, when I say she made the choice, in 1954, society made the choice for her that it would be uncomfortable for a single woman to be pregnant and working in architectures. And it was a very bad time for women in architecture anyway. I mean, she had a hard time getting a job coming out of Harvard Graduate School of Design at the top of her class. So she went off to Italy, and there are these wonderful letters between her and Lou, of which we only have his, because hers to him, according to Alex, just got lost at some point. He saved them, but then they got lost. Anyway, so you'll see that she got a lot out of Italy, and her daughter was happy to be born in Rome. That's a great thing for a painter to have in her background. And she got back here and she went back to work for Lou. And I do use the term ruthless in the book, but I don't necessarily view that as a bad thing. I mean, I'm a bit ruthless myself, so I don't know what I would have thought of him if I had known him, but I've encountered your response to him and the opposite.
What was the beginning of your collaboration with Louis Kahn? What inspired you? What was about him that drew you to this whole study?
Oh, thank you for putting it that way. My editor, who is sitting up there in the fourth to the top row, and who was my editor on the only previous biography I had written, which was Music for Silent Voices, about Shostakovich, telling his life through his quartets, wanted me to write another biography. And I did not want to write another biography. The first one had been too hard. So I kept saying no. But one Sunday, my husband and I went, it was in October of 2012, so just after it had opened, we went over to Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island to take a walk, just a fun Sunday walk. I had previously been in this building and in the Yale Art Gallery years before, and I had seen Nathaniel Kahn's movie about Louis Kahn, so I knew something about him, but very little. I didn't think he was my guy in particular. But when I was at Four Freedoms Park, when I was inside the enclosure of the monument that he made at the end of the park that was designed by Harriet Patterson, his other female collaborator and mother of his third child, inside that walled but open space, I had a feeling that I was being communicated with by a physical place. A lot of what I do, as you could tell from what Cece said, I'm a gadfly in the arts, and I pop around to all the different arts, but I particularly like to write about arts that don't have words themselves. So architecture is, of course, one of those, and I'm busy translating the art into words as best I can, both how it was made and the effect it has on me. So I could see from that one building that I would be able to do that with Louis Kahn. And then I realized he had a really interesting life. I knew that from Nathaniel's movie, so I thought, biography, this will make Eileen happy. And I have to say, as everyone who worked with Lou did, everybody has said he brought out the best in me. He made me do my best work. And I think he made me do my best work, too.
Wendy, we are so grateful to you. We're so glad you took that walk in October 2012 and shared so much of his life with us.
Thank you.
I hope all of you will join us for the reception in the library court upstairs, and there are books available, and Wendy is happy to sign them. So.